Well, thank you very much, Matt, and good morning, everyone. And I'm certainly pleased to be here to talk about or present an overview of risks due to physical climate change, or in other words, when things go wrong along the lines of that which you see depicted in the pictures on the slide. For example, on the left-hand side, we have too much water in the wrong place, affecting communities, businesses that operate in those communities, and then down to and including individual homeowners that end up in situations like this with a basement full of water. What can we do to limit that risk, to make it such that when the major precipitation events occur, we're prepared in such a way that we don't end up in this situation? We can send water to safe locations and keep people and property out of harm's way. Or on the right-hand side of the slide, how do we prepare for extreme heat? Things are going to literally get a lot hotter in major cities across Canada, certainly including Southern Ontario, between now and about 2050 to 2080. Maximum summer temperatures are going to increase by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. The number of hot days per summer are going to increase. I'll characterize these changes that are coming, but the question is, how do we prepare for extreme heat? In the middle of the slide, you see wildfire. I'm not going to talk about wildfire too much this morning because disproportionately our audience is the Greater Toronto area, the Southern Ontario region, where wildfire probably isn't going to be problematic going forward. But if we were talking about Northern Ontario, or certainly the rest of Canada, and as witnessed by what you saw last summer with wildfires, wildfire has emerged as a very formidable challenge of expression of climate change that Canada has to deal with. So I just wanted to mention it, but say that for this talk, I'm going to focus, my comments will mostly lean towards flooding and extreme heat, because they are directly applicable to the interests of most of the people on this call relative to the geography in which they live. So that's roughly speaking where we're going to go. And I'm going to start with a big picture overview of the formidability of climate change, and then I'm going to end with how do businesses prepare. So just to drill down on that theme a little bit, or where we're going to head, the first thing I'm going to do is sort of part A of the presentation, is to present the fact that climate change is irreversible. Climate change is here to stay, period. We're not going backwards on climate change. It has occurred, is occurring, and will continue to occur. And we should be doing everything within our power to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, to slow down the rate of change, but also recognize that we're not going backwards on the file. So we really need to prepare rapidly for extreme weather events, the events that are on the ground today and the bigger events that are coming. Then I'm going to document, in terms of just painting the picture of the formidability of climate change, sticking with that theme, the financial costs associated, financial and social costs associated with climate change. And not only are the costs going up, but they're going up curvilinearly. In other words, things are getting worse faster. And in part, that's driven by the fact that over the last, up to about maybe the last 2 or 3 years ago, 97% of the discussion of climate change in Canada focused on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which is a good thing to do, but very little attention focused on how do we adapt to climate change and extreme weather risk. But with the floods, the wildfires, the extreme heat events that have been occurring across the country and indeed North America globally, I think the tide has turned now such that people are recognizing, yes, we need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but we need to prepare for the extreme weather risk that is going to continue to come at us. Then the first 2 points, quite frankly, I can tell you, they're not going to put you in a good mood. It's not a feel-good message. However, on point number 3, I'll reference the fact that we have developed and continue to develop best practices to mitigate flood risk in terms of guidance documents to address flood, wildfire, extreme heat. The good news is, to a large extent, we know what to do to mitigate these, to limit these risks. The problem is we're not mobilizing the solutions or activating solutions nearly quickly enough in the country, and certainly in Southern Ontario. And then I'll say a few words about Canada's National Adaptation Strategy and the utility of the NAS, which was released by Environment Climate Change Canada about last June or July. And then we'll have a sort of a theoretical break, but it's really a continuum. Then I'm going to say a few words about how particularly institutional investors are factoring physical climate risk into the investment decision-making process. And just as those investors are interested in how do businesses deal with climate change extreme weather risks to maintain the continuity of business operations when the big storms hit, the factors that they're looking at can give guidance to companies to say, this is our businesses, this is what we need to do to prepare for these risks, because they're all sort of in the same bucket. They want a continuum of business operations. So roughly speaking, that's where we're heading. And let's start with the first point first, that climate change is irreversible. If I could have the next slide, please. So recognizing that the fact that climate change is irreversible, this is not my sort of cavalier opinion. This is an opinion expressed by many authoritative agencies, both in Canada and around the world. For example, and again, here I'm painting the picture of the formidability of climate change and the need to really embrace adaptation. So that'll be the next few slides. On the left-hand side of this slide, we see Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019. A new report along these lines will come out in, I think it's 2025, next year. This report was authored by about a dozen climate scientists working for Environment and Climate Change Canada, well-informed individuals on the topic. And in that report, they recognize, and I'll read the lower left-hand corner word for word, it's in italics because the statement comes directly from the report. They make the point that climate change has, Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence, the burning of fossil fuels, putting CO2 in the atmosphere and trapping heat that would otherwise escape into space, being held as an envelope around the Earth, causing warming. So that's the 15-second version of the greenhouse effect. This warming is effectively irreversible. And this statement by Environment Climate Change Canada, this is the first time I'm aware of that the federal government actually recognized the irreversibility of climate change, which really opened the door for much more aggressively embracing adaptation. Similarly, in 2022, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is, if you're not familiar with them, it's several hundred climate scientists that all they do 7 days a week is study climate science. In this report that they released in 2022, they say it is indisputable that human activities, i.e. the burning of fossil fuels, are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts more frequent and severe. And then they presented an update to that report about a year ago, where they said some future changes are unavoidable and or irreversible, but can be limited by deep, rapid, and sustained greenhouse gas emissions reductions. In other words, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, it's a good thing to do, but it's just really going to slow down the rate of change. My point here is really to say to people that it is very good that efforts are being expressed through meetings such as COP28 or the Paris Accord, or increasing discussions about net zero. These are all good things to do and pursue. But we have to be careful that people don't interpret that as meaning we're going to get off the hook on climate change, that we don't have to prepare. No, we have to prepare. And all the efforts pertaining to COP, Paris Accord, net zero, and other initiatives, they'll slow down the rate of change, but not reverse it. So we really need to embrace adaptation. And just in case this hasn't put you in a bad enough mood already, on the right-hand side of the slide, you see that during the first COP meetings held in 1995, the world was utilizing about 70 million barrels of oil a day. This is in 1995 during COP1. So now we've just had COP28. In 2028, according to the International Energy Agency, which is the preeminent agency in the world that looks at energy use, they recognize that in 2028, just a couple of years from now, the world's use of oil will be about 106 million barrels a day. So 50% higher than was being utilized in terms of oil demand globally relative to the first COP in 1995. And by the way, this is not impugning COP. I'm not saying COP isn't a good thing to do. In the absence of COP, it might be that the world is going to be using 130 million barrels of oil a day or something like that in 2028. So, but I just want to drive home the point that, climate change is not going to go away. And by the way, we could have a 3-hour lecture on this topic, but those are a few high points. Next slide, please. The costs of climate change are, now we're talking about, this is data for Canada, but quite frankly, if we had a chart for Ontario, it follows exactly the same trend. One of the ways we can document the costs associated with climate change and extreme weather events is to look at the catastrophic loss in insurable claims realized in the country. And if you're not familiar with it, in insurance terms, a catastrophic event is any event like a flood, wildfire, windstorm, ice storm, whatever it might be. If it triggers more than $25 million in insurance claims, that event gets captured on this chart. And so along the x-axis is time, from the lower left-hand corner, 1983, to the lower right, 2022. And we just got the data in for 2023, which I'll give you in a second. But we have time along the x-axis and billions of dollars paid out in insurance claims on the y-axis. And by the way, all this data has been corrected for inflation and for per capita wealth accumulation. In other words, if you were insuring twice as many homes today as you did 10 years ago, you would expect, with nothing going on, the insurance claims to be twice as high due to twice as many homes being insured. That phenomena has also, it's been factored into or out of this data, if you will, such that horizontally, we're looking at a comparison of apples to apples. And what's notable here is that from 1983 up to 2008, the insurance industry in the country could count on the property and casualty insurance sector in the country could count on paying out between about $250 to $450 million per year in insurance claims due to flooding or wildfire or whatever it might be. Everything started to change on or about 2009 onwards, whereby for 13 out of the last 14 years, and now it's 14 out of the last 15, the catastrophic loss claims have gone over $1 billion per year, every year for 13 out of the last 14 years, for an average cost of about $2.1 billion. And the culprit that's driving most of the upward bend in this curve, you notice the curve, it's not just a straight line going up, it's going up curvilinearly. The culprit that's driving most of the upward bend in this curve is too much water in the wrong place, flooding. And by the way, residential basement flooding, basements flooding, that's the #1 cost of climate change in Canada, but also wildfire is a major contributor. And the 2023 data came in at $3.1 billion. 2022 has just been updated to $3.4 billion, the bar you see on the right-hand side of the screen. 2023 data just came in at $3.1 billion. In other words, last year was the 4th worst year on record for Canada for catastrophic loss claims. The curve continues to bend up. And the point of that is to say we need to mobilize known solutions to mitigate expressions of extreme weather risk, and we need to do so a lot more quickly than is currently happening in the country, than is currently happening in Ontario or Southern Ontario. Pretty much doesn't matter where you look. And by the way, we're also in the position now whereby by not being on top of this file to the degree we should have been, 10% of homes in Canada now, 1.5 million residences, are no longer insurable relative to flood risk. These are people who can't get insurance coverage for their homes for basement flooding. Because the premiums that insurers would have to charge to cover, to provide that coverage they're almost logarithmic. It'd be like paying 3 mortgages. So cheating the system or not paying attention to the formidability of the challenge it's caught up to us. So we really need to embrace adaptation thoroughly. Next slide, please. And still, this is all in the category of depressing you still. We in this case, it was the Intact Center working with CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and the Global Risk Institute, which advises pension funds in the country on emerging issues. We produced this report, Treading Water, the Impact of Catastrophic Flooding on Canada's Housing Market. And basically the objective of the report was when situations occur like you see on the front cover of the report, catastrophic flooding in communities, it's quite obvious that when an event like this occurs, it's not good for the housing market or for the housing industry. But the question is, what kind of negative impact does this flooding in communities have on the residential housing market, particularly in reference to the price at which homes sell that are in communities that experience these types of events across the country, and other variables being how many homes is there a change in the number of listings of homes to be sold in communities in the aftermath of flooding? If you try to sell a home in communities that flood, how long does it take longer to sell the house? Or do we see people in situations whereby when their house is in a community like this, and perhaps they have or have not, but just being in that community, do they realize mortgage arrears or deferrals? So we did a study to address this question, and we looked at multiple cities across Canada from east to west, in areas within cities that experience catastrophic flooding, major floods along, kind of look like what you see on the cover of the report. And we would have a nearby community, the same in all regards as the flood impacted community, but that wasn't flooded. And for a period of 6 months after a major flood occurred, we would look at the changes in the data as per the right-hand side of the slide. And the big one people are interested in is the sold price of homes. We would say, what was the change in the sold price of homes in a flood impacted community for 6 months after following a flood as compared to a nearby community? Changes in the sold price of homes over the same period of time, with the only difference between the two being flooding. One was flooded, one wasn't. So if we saw the price increase of homes in a flood impacted community for 6 months after flooding being up 3%, but in the non-flood impacted community, the prices went up 10%, we could say that differential, that 7%, that was directly attributable to the flooding. So that's more or less how the study worked. And by the way, getting the data for this was not easy, but that's a different topic. What we found at the end of the day is that over the last 10 years in Canada, in flood impacted communities, homes sold, whether the home was flooded or not, didn't matter. Just being in a flood impacted community, that reduced the sold price of homes, the price at which homes sold, by 8.2%. And so just to be clear, this is not modeling or some sort of theoretical construct. This is actually the real data. This is what's already happened in the country. Flooding reduced, on average, the sold price of homes by 8.2%. So if you had a home that would have sold for $1 million, now it would have sold for $920,000. The average number of listings of homes put on the market for sale after flooding, it decreased substantially, 44%. Perhaps due to people waiting for the stigma of flooding to pass before they put their home on the market. If people did put their home on the market for sale, it took 20% longer to sell a house. And although we didn't see a spike in mortgage arrears and deferrals, people's paying their mortgages, the reduction in the price of homes changed the loan to value ratio on homes, which meant that banks or CMHC-backed mortgages, they were taking on more risk than they realized. So the point is, this is just one more example of where climate change and extreme weather risk, if we don't get a handle on it, if we don't work to mitigate the types of events you see on the screen here, in this case in reference to flooding, we're going to see more and more of these negative impacts. So let's turn to the positive part of the equation. Next slide, please. One of the things that's happened in Canada, and matter of fact, I'm sure there's people on this call who've been part of the solutions. I know there are people on this call that have been part of the solutions. In Canada, the good news is we just haven't been, sitting on our hands for the last 10 years, waiting for bad things to happen in terms of expressions of climate change and not preparing. A great deal of work has been done to mitigate flood risk in the country. And by the way, the contributors to the reports and the documents that I'll describe in a second, you see on the front of this report, there's a big we involved in developing guidance and how to mitigate risk as per the titles on the screen here. And the Standards Council of Canada has been instrumental. The National Research Council, Canadian Standards Association, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, certainly in Ontario, the conservation authorities, lots of NGOs, academics, and so forth, collectively provided input to the documents you see on the screen here that I'll now describe. So there's a big we involved in developing this stuff. But The good news for Canada is, for example, in reference to flooding, Canada's most expensive expression of extreme weather risk, we actually have very good guidance on how to mitigate flood risk at the level of the home, for new community design. How do we build new communities going forward in such a way that they don't all flood out when the big storms hit? How do we retrofit existing communities to mitigate flood risk, to send water to safe locations using berms, diversion channels, holding ponds, cisterns, bioswales, permeable surfacing, various forms of natural infrastructure? What do we do for commercial real estate to make it so the big storms hit, office towers don't end up with underground parking lots full of water? Along the coastlines, beyond the scope of this talk, but the next time a Hurricane Fiona comes up the east coast of Canada, how can we know what to do to protect communities so they're not wiped out by a hurricane? We have good guidance on flood risk. Similarly, on wildfire risk, we just released this report a couple of months ago that received, we probably did 150, 200 interviews on this report. In this report, we outlined, working with Fire Smart Canada and other Natural Resources Canada and other groups, we know what to do for community at the community level and the level of the home to very much lower the probability that homes will burn down or communities will burn down when fires come through a region. In terms of extreme heat, on the right-hand side of the slide, we know what to do to mitigate the effects of extreme heat for people at the community level to address the heat island effect, but also, for example, people living in older apartment buildings that can really be heat traps. What can we do to help protect those people? A lot of work on retaining and restoring natural infrastructure in the country to mitigate flood risk, or retaining natural infrastructure in communities to mitigate the heat island effect. How do we retain and restore natural infrastructure in that regard? We realize not only the flood risk mitigation of impacts of upside or heat risk mitigation upside, but we also, for example, support biodiversity, carbon capture and sequestration, and retaining the aesthetics of communities through retaining natural infrastructure. We've documented that the health impacts, the psychosocial, the mental health impacts of extreme weather events are substantial, and I won't say anything more about that. That's a talk in and of itself. And we've been very heavily engaged with the capital markets of how do investors take physical climate risk and factor it into investment decision-making. If you're investing in a company, you want to know that when a flood occurs or a wildfire occurs or some other extreme weather events, is that going to shut down the operations of the business, or will employees not be able to get work to run the business? Will your customer base disappear because they're dealing with extreme weather impacts and now you've got no market to sell into? So how do the capital markets take these factors into account? So the good news is, and it goes beyond what you see on the screen here, in Canada, we actually have very good guidance on how to mitigate risk. So the good news on climate change is, to a large extent, we know what the problems are. We know where they're going to be expressed to a large extent. We actually have the solutions to mitigate the risk. The problem is we're not mobilizing solutions nearly quickly enough. That's the trick in the system. We have to figure out how to take known solutions and put them in place so that we don't end up with disasters. I'm going to reference just one or two actions that we can take to mitigate risk in the area of flooding, but recognizing that these are almost full-day seminars in and of themselves. But we can start with mitigating flood risk at the level of the home, actually empowering homeowners to help themselves to not realize a flooded basement. Next slide, please. What you're looking at here on the right-hand side of the slide is an infographic. In other words, a single page that has pictorials on it. This infographic summarizes what is otherwise presented in a 50 or 60 page report. And one of the things we've found at the Intact Center over the years is that although people want to know reports exist, and as user-friendly as you can write them, and also have executive summaries that say, this is what needs to be done to mitigate some aspect of risk, by and large, people don't read reports. That's just the way it is. Ministers, deputy ministers, mayors, councillors, busy people, executives, it doesn't matter who it is. By and large, people don't read reports, but they like to know reports exist. So what we have found works very well is we have the reports, but then we take the core messaging from the report and put it onto a one-page infographic that people latch onto. They almost become addicted to it when you show it to them. So so the way this one works for home flood protection is along the top row. And by the way, these things are all crafted. Every picture here, that if you actually had the full thing in front of you, that you can see the full size. When you look at any of these infographics, 99% of people will understand instantaneously what it's telling them to do. And indeed, if you're in a meeting with a minister, a deputy minister, or whoever it happens to be, and you put these infographics in front of them, you almost can't have the meeting because they just stare at this thing and they say, holy cow, I just saw 6 things I need to do around my house this weekend. And so just the way it works, on the top row, we have 5 things you can do around a home for $0 to lower the probability of basement flooding. The middle row are things you can do for under $250. And the bottom row are things you do for over $250, but by and large, quite frankly, they're not all that expensive, even for those. And just to illustrate, for example, on the top row, the 4th box over from the right, it says test your sub pump. In many homes, people have a well in the basement, below the basement floor, that if water got into the basement, it goes into this well or this bucket, collects there, and then you have a pump in the bottom of the well that turns on and through a tube pumps water outside. One action homeowners can take, for example, is test the sub pump before the big storm occurs to make sure it works, i.e. pour a bucket of water in the sump well, see, does the sump pump turn on and pump water outside? If it does, that's good. Most people find out that their sub pump doesn't work when they have 3.5 feet of sewer water in their basement. And so for what could be a 10-minute check spring and fall, you could avoid a flooded basement. And by the way, the average cost of a flooded basement in Canada is $43,000. So if 5 minutes of your time to check the sub pump is a pretty good use of time. And I'm not going to go through all these images, but let me just go to the bottom row with one more example, and I'll stick with our friend the sub pump. So the lower right-hand corner, you have a sub pump, but you can also have 2 sub pumps just in case one fails. Also, you can add a battery backup supply to run the sub pump up to 48 to 72 hours in the event that the electricity goes out during a major precipitation event or storm. So in other words, the time you need the sub pump to work is when the big storms hit, and very often when the big storms hit, the electricity goes out. So the time you actually need it to work, it may not be available if you don't have a backup energy source. So this is a kit that can be implemented around the average home for $300 or $400, including the battery, that can give you peace of mind that if the electricity goes out, my sub pump will still pump water outside. So all the other depictions along here are along the same lines. Plastic covers over window wells, ensuring you keep the eaves troughs empty and allow water to flow away from the house, etc. By the way, we even found, parenthetically, that we went into 700 homes in New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, and spent about 1.5 to 3.5 hours per house just looking at any features around a house that could affect basement flooding. And one of the things we found, to quite frankly my astonishment, is 70% of the homes we looked at, in other words, 70% of the homes in the country, have somewhere around the home where grading actually directs water towards the house versus away. There's a correctable action right away. So now, in terms of mitigating flood risk, and by the way, if people have a flooded basement, the average period of time they miss from work is 7.1 days. We've also done that analysis. So if someone has a flooded basement, there is a business relevancy to it, in the sense that, minimally, the average for those people, they're not going to be going to work for at least 7 business days on average. So that means you don't have an employee showing up. One of the things we're doing now to mobilize this information, we've got this infographic now goes out to about 3.2 million households across Canada, about 7 million Canadians, where multiple municipalities across the country are now, they attach their logo to it, and they're now distributing this material to homeowners in property tax notices. So when the property tax notices go out, which is an envelope you have to open, you can't throw away as junk mail, you receive this guidance. And what we have found, and that's and then through other forms of communication, the material is being conveyed to homeowners. When people receive this information, and this is a lot of work we did with the Red Cross to test its uptake. When people receive this guidance and you go back to their homes 6 months later, 70% of people report having taken 2 actions to mitigate basement flood risk that they otherwise wouldn't have taken in the absence of receiving this material. So what it tells you is that people will act to protect their property when they know what to do. The reason they're not acting is they don't know what to do. Most of the things on this slide, on this infographic, can be operationalized without special expertise or very limited expertise. Any handy person can do most of it, generally for less than a few $100s, and often this can be operationalized over a long weekend. And so this should be point number one, an action to be taken across the country to mitigate flood risk. Next slide, please. And similarly, and I don't have time to do it, but at the community level or in reference to business operations, we have infographics that are equally, I would say, impressive, if you will, that give guidance to at the community level. What do you do to mitigate risk, or what do you do at the level of office towers, condo towers? Here's one example that of a material that can be laid out, a barrier to water can be laid out in anticipation of a flood event occurring in 2 to 4 hours around multiple city blocks. This is material that when it's rolled out, there are different forms of it. When water comes up to it, you see on the upper left-hand corner what it looks like, this portable barrier deflated. When water comes up to it, this thing is designed, this barrier, to self-inflate and hold water back, as you see depicted in the picture, and then a similar type of technology on the right-hand side. This is an example of how large business operators, for example, of commercial real estate, these are one of the tools they're using to hold water back from otherwise impacted buildings that would be otherwise impacted. This costs very, very little to put in place compared to the damage realized due to flooding, and it can be used over and over and over again. On the left-hand side, this was in, I think it was in Calgary or Edmonton, one of the two. The people that had this equipment for this particular building, they actually went and showed us how quickly they could roll this out around multiple city blocks in 1 hour, put it in place in anticipation of storm. And this put them in a position so that they're not running out at the last minute, putting hundreds of thousands of sandbags in place. Sandbags should be the point of last resort, not the point of first resort. Next slide, please. And the point there was, by the way, there's a lot you can do to prepare businesses to not be impacted, in that case, by flood risk. And that was just one example. Now I'm going to say a few words about extreme heat. Extreme heat, with flooding and wildfires in the country, those are the two most financially costly impacts in the country. Extreme heat is in a different category. When extreme heat events occur, they're not financially costly, but they are costly in terms of human toll. With flooding and wildfire, they're financially costly, but by and large, with floods, wildfire events, people don't die. It's maybe 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 people, sort of in that order. And I don't mean to sound indelicate. One person dying is one too many, but the numbers are very, very low. With extreme heat, it's a whole new ballgame for Canada. When extreme heat events, people die, and they can die in very high numbers. In 2021, in British Columbia, we had 619 people die prematurely due to extreme heat. In 2018 in Quebec, we had 86 people die prematurely due to extreme heat. And by the way, under both conditions, they died under good conditions. In other words, the electricity was running. Had there been an elongated electricity outage for either one of those heat waves, those deaths would have easily gone up into the thousands. And it's just by dumb luck that the electricity kept running for providing fans and air conditioning. Going forward in Canada, between now and about 2050 to 2080 range, and this is a lot of work done by the Prairie Climate Institute and others, extreme heat is going to prove increasingly problematic. For most cities across the country, including those in southern Ontario, maximum summer temperatures are going to increase between now and 2050 to 2080. They'll be gradually climbing up. Maximum summer temperatures, the hottest temperature you realize in the summer, for most cities across the country, it's going to increase by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. So, for example, in the Greater Toronto region, right now we tap out at about 37 degrees Celsius. By 2050 to 2080, that will go up to about 40 to 41 degrees Celsius. Also, the number of hot days per summer, days over 30 degrees Celsius, that number for most Canadian cities is going to double between now and 2050. And in some cases, triple. And in cases like Windsor, Ontario, quadruple the number of hot days per summer. So in the Toronto region, for many of the people on this call, right now we have about more or less 17, 18 days per summer that exceed 30 degrees Celsius. That's going to go to about 50 to 60 days per summer. So the heat is coming. The three areas in Canada that are most vulnerable to extreme heat going forward, it's the southern valley regions in British Columbia, bordering on the US border. That's number one. That's one of three. The other area that's going to get disproportionately hot going forward are the southern prairie regions along the US border. And then the third area that's going to realize extreme heat, which is perhaps most relevant to people on this call, is the north shore of Lake Erie on out through to the St. Lawrence River Valley. These are the three areas that are going to realize the most extreme heat going forward. And the three groups of people that are the most vulnerable to extreme heat at the top of the list, and this is applicable for Southern Ontario, at the top of the list, it's the elderly, people over 70 years of age, living alone, who are financially challenged, which is sort of code for they probably don't have a air conditioning. And they probably live in a disenfranchised area of a city where there's not a lot of park and shade area outside for them to find relief from extreme heat. So the number one group is that group, the elderly. Number two are the homeless living on the streets. And then, I guess by definition, and then the third group are people with pre-existing health conditions that are very often a combination of both cardiac and respiratory in nature. These are the three groups we have to help. One of the aspects that we need to mobilize to help the elderly, for example, that living alone, financially challenged, is we need to set up a system in cities, including Toronto and surrounding cities, to identify where are these people, where do they actually live, and then have it that, and we know all this before a heat wave hits, and we make it such during a heat wave, somebody is checking in on them on a regular daily basis to make sure they're okay. Do they have an air conditioner? Do they have a fan? Are they properly hydrated? Do they need a trip to a cooling center? That sort of thing. That's one measure of multiple measures of adaptation we need to employ to help these people. Next slide, please. And although I won't go into it here because we don't have the time, here's another example of where we've taken reports we've produced on the lethality of extreme heat in Canada going forward. Here's one of the infographics. We have them for the community level as well, and for individual houses. Here's one of the infographics for apartment and condo heat protection, actions that can be taken either behaviorally or structurally to mitigate the impacts of extreme heat that can be lethal to people in, under the wrong circumstances, as I described. In the upper left-hand corner, for example, that pictorial focuses on knowing where are the vulnerable people living, who's checking on them on a daily basis. That's a behavioral step you can do. And that's an action for, no money. It's just, you could almost combine it with a group like Meals on Wheels or something like that would know where these people are. In the lower right-hand corner, and then in between, we have passive cooling. We have glazing on windows to keep sunlight from passing through a window into an apartment, causing it to heat up disproportionately. We can have mechanical shutters on windows, awnings over windows to keep sunlight out. Strategically placed plants on balconies or around buildings to provide more shade to limit the heating effect of during extreme heat event. But ultimately, if you have an extended heat wave, passive cooling, these are all good things to do, but they buy you a few days. if it's 38 or 39 degrees Celsius for an extended period of time, eventually heat will creep into a building. And so one of the things we need to consider, and this is something we've talked about quite a bit, and it drew a huge amount of attention in the media, we need to think about access to cooling as a fundamental human right. Just as we think of access to warmth right now, it's happening in real time. Access to warmth in the winter as being a fundamental human right to keep people out of harm's way due to extreme cold. People can die just as quickly due to extreme heat in the absence of access to air conditioning. So air conditioning or heat pump, which a heat pump in the summer is just an air conditioner, access to cooling, at least at the level of one room, we really need to think about this as a fundamental human right. And by the way, for Toronto right now, Toronto is a ticking time bomb for extreme heat being problematic. And these numbers I'm going to give to you right now, I've quadruple checked, so they're correct. Right now, in the Greater Toronto region, we have approximately 500,000 people living in apartment buildings that are 8 stories or higher, that are 40 years of age or older, and for one third of the dwellers in those apartment buildings, for one third of those apartment buildings, they have backup power generation for 1.5 to 2.5 hours only, and that is it. So if there was a multi-day heat wave combined with an electricity outage, an elongated electricity outage, you could have a 75-year-old couple sitting on the 20th floor in one of these buildings for which there was only 1.5 to 2.5 hours of backup generation, that 3 days later, they could be on the 20th floor of this building with no fan, no air conditioner. Water won't come out of the taps above the 6th or 7th floor, just under city pressure. So they'd be up there without water, and they'd have no egress, no way out, because even the emergency elevators wouldn't be running because they've gone beyond the 1.5 to 2.5 hour time frame. So this is a powder keg waiting to happen if we don't get ahead of the curve on this, where thousands of people could die very, very easily. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I actually am trying to be dramatic. Like, this is something that we need to attend to. Let's not have management by disaster. Next slide, please. And I just want to draw your attention to, this is a good news item, the fact that Canada launched its national adaptation strategy last June or July. This outlines for the federal government, they put their cards on the table to say, this is what we're committing to in terms of targets. There are 26 targets presented in the national adaptation strategy. This is what we're committing to mitigate flood, wildfire, and extreme heat risk across Canada. So the national adaptation strategy focuses on 3 perils: flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. So there's lots of things it's not considering, but within the regard of those 3 perils, there are 26 targets in the report, that 10 of which are to be mobilized or operationalized in 2024, 25, or 26. In other words, a short-term time horizon to which accountability can be had. If you haven't looked at the National Adaptation Strategy, I would strongly encourage you to do so. And quite frankly, you can read page 20 to 31, and that hits the targets. That's the part that you really need to read. And you can consider, how can I and or our business enterprise or our municipality or whatever it is, what is the contribution we can make to realizing success on targets in the NAS? One of the targets in the lower right-hand corner here, I'll just read it. It's very consistent with what we've been talking about. It says, by 2025, which is basically now, next year, 50% of Canadians have taken concrete actions to better prepare for and respond to climate change risks facing their household. So that is a good, solid target. But how do we make it happen? This is an area that we're quite involved in at the Intech Center, making this happen, using a lot of the information we talked about earlier in terms of infographics. But the good news is Canada now has a direction, so I would encourage people to look at this to help move the whole adaptation file forward. And by the way, always remember, for businesses, if employees aren't showing up for work because of an extreme weather event of any type, your business isn't going to operate. Or on the back end, if you have a customer base that is wiped out, your business isn't going to operate. So the success of businesses to maintain continuity of business operations is very much dependent on employees showing up for work and having customers. And if either is impacted, you're out of business. Um, just very briefly, Entergy, which is an integrated full services utility provider that operates in the Gulf Coast region. Entergy was way ahead of the curve on climate change, extreme weather risks, sustainability years before it became popular. Now it's called ESG. But before Hurricane Katrina hit, Entergy really weather hardened its operations to operate in the aftermath, during and in the aftermath of a hurricane. However, from a business perspective, they were almost put out of business despite all that effort, because the one thing they didn't look at was working at weather hardening the communities into which they sold utilities. In other words, their employees weren't showing up for work because they were all flooded out, and the businesses that they sold their product into weren't operating. So it's not good enough just to make sure your business is capable of operating. That capability depends on the surrounding landscape. Next slide, please. I think so. If Matt, if it's cool, do you want to just keep? There's just 3 more slides, and
just was gonna say, thank you so much for everything covered so far, and just in the interest of time, just touching on these in a couple minutes so we can get to Sharon's talk would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, all I really want to do, next slide, please, is emphasize, and quite frankly, there's 2 slides after this, I think I can skip, is emphasize that through various reports you see on the screen, we've been involved in, and the we means the Intact Center, largely working with the Global Risk Institute, which is the primary advisor to pension funds as to how they should take climate change, extreme weather risk into account. We've actually developed a system that can help a portfolio manager. If you're someone at Canada Pension Plan or BMO Asset Management or something like that, and you're looking at a company coming in your office that afternoon trying to get you to invest pension money in their operations, it would be the president, the CFO, they're on a roadshow presenting their company and hoping that this investor will invest in them. One of the questions, increasingly so, that the investment community is cognizant of is the need to ensure that the companies they invest in, that they're going to actually be viable entities up and running and not disproportionately impacted by flooding, wildfire, extreme heat, windstorms, ice storms, whatever it is that might shut down operations for a period of weeks, imperil the capacity of that business to generate revenue, which could cause a negative impact on share price. So I really just want to highlight or bring to your attention, and then you can look at these reports at your leisure. They're all on our website. The top left-hand one being the most relevant, the most recent. We've actually developed a way to put together a simple matrix that portfolio managers can use along the top line of, maybe go to the next slide and they can just say it. Along the top line of which, and this is for the electricity and transmission and distribution sector, but you can do it for any sector. We've done it for about 10 now. We've actually identified, by working with climate risk experts and those who have expertise in the area of electricity transmission and distribution, we went through a process to determine that flooding, wildfire, extreme heat, windstorms, snow and ice loading, and thawing permafrost, these are the perils that are most problematic to the transmission and distribution sector. And then under each of those headings, we've identified the 1 or 2 factors that are the most problematic for the business continuity as being affected by these perils. And then the line below that, in the middle of the chart, identifies the actions that the company should be taking to mitigate the risk, to give a degree of comfort to the investor that they're not going to be shut down by, in this example, snow and ice loading. And my point here is that just for businesses to be cognizant of the fact that increasingly so, investors are thinking about climate change and extreme weather risk and the preparedness of companies they invest in to not be unduly impacted by these extreme weather events. So all I wanted to do is bring that to your attention and say that for your own business operations, have you actually considered the potential vulnerabilities of your business to extreme weather events, and have you taken the actions to mitigate those risks ahead of the curve? And increasingly so going forward, this will be important for 2 reasons. One is to attract investor money. Number 2, You don't want to have your business enterprise shut down due to an ice storm or a windstorm or whatever it might be. Next slide, please. And then next slide after that. This one just says what I just said. So very quickly, to sum up in 30 seconds, as per points I've touched upon, number one, climate change is here to stay. There will be no new normal in the weather, just evolving risks. Sometimes you hear the expression the new normal. There is going to be no new normal. The expression of extreme weather being problematic is going to get worse and worse and worse over time, period. Homes and communities must prepare for extreme weather. Businesses cannot operate if employees and customers have flooded homes or people dying due to extreme heat. Home flood protection education should be a priority program in this country. I spent a lot of time with the Minister of Environment on exactly this point. Extreme heat is the most underestimated threat facing Southern Ontario. Access to cooling should be a human right. We really need to get on top of this issue. And businesses, as per my last point just before this slide, businesses should self-assess for vulnerability to extreme weather risk and correct for deficiencies. Don't have management by disaster. Get ahead of the curve. The best way to solve the problem is don't have the problem. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much for that, Blair. I think that was a very informative overview of the risks, but just want to point out two of the key points that you made around, a lot of the emphasis was on that community and homeowner level, but how that is directly relevant to the businesses that we have on the call, as per your points here in the summary, in terms of if it's impacting people at home and in their communities, it's also impacting them at work. So something to keep in mind. Also want to pick up on the positives that you've highlighted here as well, in terms of the very tangible and practical guidance that currently exists in Canada. And hopefully that can reassure folks and motivate them to start looking at that and taking some action. So quickly, we will share these slides out after today's presentation. So if you weren't able to capture exactly the names of the reports, we'll have all of that. We'll also link to the Intact Center's resources and business risk matrices as well, as that will be super helpful. But I think with those points, it dovetails nicely into our next presentation. So now I'd like to turn things over to Sharon Lamb. And Sharon, if we're able to go through your presentation to about 10:45, just so that we have some time for questions, that would be fantastic. And yeah, once again, encourage people to submit any questions they have through the chat, and we'll make time for that at the end.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharon Lamb, and I'm a research scientist in the Ecosystem and Climate Science team at Toronto Region Conservation Authority. I'm excited to be here today, and I'm especially thrilled to follow Blair's presentation. As we clearly saw from Blair's talk, climate change is no longer something far out in the distant future. It's happening now, and it's impacting people, businesses, and communities all around the world. On this title slide, we have temperature stripes showing 180 years of measured historical temperature data from a local climate station in the city of Toronto, starting from 1840 on the left and going up to 2020 on the right. And each colored stripe represents the difference in annual average temperature compared to average temperature over the entire 20th century. Red means warmer than average, and blue means cooler than average. So as we can see, local temperatures are getting progressively warmer and faster in recent decades. But as Blair also noted, we have the tools and technology available to reduce the impacts of climate change and build resilience. So this presentation will walk through how your business or organization can conduct climate change risk assessments to understand your risks and help inform your adaptation journey. Next slide, please. Let's start by situating risk assessments within the broader adaptation planning process so we don't lose sight of forest for the trees. As this diagram illustrates, the adaptation planning process typically starts with understanding how the climate is changing and conducting vulnerability and risk assessments. From there, we identify and evaluate actions, prioritize them for implementation, monitor and adjust as part of adaptive management, which is intended as an iterative process. And this process is enabled by strong leadership, partnership, collaboration, and governance, among other enabling factors. So climate change risk assessments often represent a key first step in adaptation planning, but the work certainly doesn't stop there. And while this workshop is focused on adaptation, which has historically received less attention than mitigation, as Blair mentioned, it's important to keep in mind that neither mitigation nor adaptation alone is enough. They need to go hand in hand, and we need to be able to do both at the same time. Next slide, please. Climate risk assessments are also a key part of climate-related financial disclosures, the disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities through financial reporting. This might be something that your business or organization is interested in undertaking or may soon be compelled to undertake, depending on your business. And based on recommendations developed by an industry-led task force, climate-related disclosures should be structured around 4 themes: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Under risk management, the focus is on disclosing how your organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risks. More specifically, it focuses on whether your organization has a process for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks, as well as whether this process is integrated into your organization's overall risk management and decision-making. So another benefit of completing a climate risk assessment is that it can help inform disclosure efforts, which is now guided by the International Sustainability Standards Board. Next slide, please. Let's now take a look at common risk assessment approaches. On the left, we have a diagram adapted from ISO 31000, a risk management standard published by the International Organization for Standardization. It starts off with establishing the scope and context, followed by the risk assessment, which encompasses risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. Risk treatment options are then identified, documented, and integrated into monitoring and reporting. And throughout this process, communicating and consulting with internal and external stakeholders can be very helpful. On the right, we have a very similar process developed by Health Canada for assessing vulnerability to extreme heat as another example. And for the remainder of the presentation, we'll walk through each step of the risk assessment process and hopefully provide you with a better sense of how your business and organization can complete a climate change risk assessment of your own. And for those of you who have already completed climate risk assessments or have initiated one, I would love to hear about your experiences as well during the Q&A discussion. So starting with scoping stage on the next slide, if you can flip one more. Scoping is important because climate risk assessments can take many forms. For example, risk assessments have been completed for specific sectors or systems, such as the health system, food system, and transportation system, for example. They might focus on a specific infrastructure or asset type, such as buildings and forests. They can also vary by spatial scale, ranging from the facility or site level to broader geographic scales. Assessments have also looked at different future periods based on how far out into the future you need to plan for, whether it's the next 30, 50, or 80 years, for example. They can vary by level of detail, from high-level risk screening to more detailed assessments, for example, where impact modeling might be involved. Some are geospatial and involve mapping, while others may not. And finally, assessments can also vary by complexity, from focus on a single hazard, such as flooding, to consideration of multiple hazards, such as flooding and heat, and maybe even cascading risks. Next slide, please. Here are some example scoping questions that you might consider. And this is not intended to be exhaustive. What decisions are you hoping to inform? What's the purpose and how will the assessment results be used? What is the required timeframe and resources needed for completing the assessment? Who will be part of the project team? Will it be completed in-house or will it be contracted out? What climate-related risks are of most interest? Is it flooding, heat, vector-borne diseases, for example? What future time periods and climate scenarios should be considered? What data and information are available, and who should be engaged throughout the process, and how will they be engaged? Ultimately, all of these considerations should be guided by a set of principles as illustrated in the diagram on the right. Risk management should support your business or organization's value creation and protection. It should be integrated, participatory, structured and comprehensive, contextual and localized, easy to use, inclusive, scalable and transferable, replicable, and be based on the best available information and seek continual improvement. On the next slide, we'll walk through an example case scenario using the health system as our example. Let's say we want to ensure that our healthcare system, healthcare facility, network, or system is resilient or remains functional during and after an adverse event. This means it not only needs to withstand the adverse event, but if functionality is adversely affected, then response and recovery also needs to be quick and effective. And ideally, the facility, network, or system ends up better off than where we started. With that in mind, let's take a look at how we might frame our potential risk assessment on the next slide. So in our example, the decisions that we're hoping to inform are mainly related to operations and emergency management. So we might want to look at how climate-related risks may affect hospital admissions, for example. We have, let's say, 1 to 2 years to complete the assessment, but it's well funded. We essentially have all the resources that we need at our disposal because it's been identified as a strategic priority. It will be completed in-house by a team of risk and sustainability experts. And the focus is on acute shocks such as extreme heat, wildfires, and flooding as a first step. This is part of our strategic long-term planning, so we want to look at both the 2050s and 2100s, and we also want to consider multiple climate scenarios to plan for possible futures. So we'll select the very high and moderate emission scenarios, which translates to roughly +4 and +2 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century, respectively. We have both quantitative emissions data and qualitative data that we can tap into, including the knowledge and experience of staff and stakeholders. And people we might want to engage include end users and decision makers who will ultimately use the results of the assessment, such as administrators, operations staff, medical staff, paramedics, patients, community members, NGOs, and government, for example. So this case scenario just seeks to highlight some of the thinking that goes into the scoping of a risk assessment and what your business or organization might want to get out of the risk assessment. Next slide, please. At the outset of the risk assessment process, it can also be helpful to establish your risk criteria. How much risk is tolerable or acceptable to your business or organization? When does a risk need to be treated? When is it appropriate to do nothing? When would adaptation options need to be identified? When would it make sense to undertake further analysis to better understand risk? When would it be appropriate to maintain existing controls? And when do you need to reconsider your objectives? And while it's encouraged that you establish these at the beginning, it's also important to recognize that risks can evolve over time, which is why it's important to revisit your risk assessment and treatments from time to time as the risk landscape changes. Next, we'll move on to the risk assessment stage, which captures risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. Can flip one more, please? Risk assessments can typically be approached from the top down, bottom up, or a mix of both. The top down approach generally begins with a global climate modeling output that is downscaled to local or regional level, and then integrated into impact modeling to determine vulnerability. The bottom up approach typically begins with understanding past and current climate impacts, usually based on local knowledge, to determine local sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Then comes future climate projections to see how the future climate may affect existing factors to determine vulnerability. These two approaches are not mutually exclusive and can be undertaken together to build a better understanding of potential climate-related impacts. Next slide, please. Now, regardless of the approach you take, it is still important to understand how the climate is changing. So where can you access climate data and information? The Government of Canada has worked with partners to develop a suite of national climate data portals, and these portals provide publicly accessible climate data at a resolution of approximately 10 kilometers and cover all of Canada. These portals are tailored for different users, ranging from beginners to more advanced users. Climate Atlas is perhaps the most intuitive and notably includes Indigenous map layers that identify the locations of many First Nations and Inuit communities and Métis projects. ClimateData.ca in the middle offers further capability to customize and download data to suit your needs and has an online support form that you can easily fill out if you have any questions. Both of these portals also offer additional resources, including sector-specific information that might be helpful for your business or organization. Pavix, the third portal on the right, is intended for more advanced users who have knowledge of the programming language Python. Next, I'll just show a couple of quick examples from climatedata.ca. We did see some information from Climate Atlas from Blair's presentation earlier. Let's say we're looking for data related to extreme heat. Here's what the map viewer on climatedata.ca looks like. Right now, we're looking at days with maximum temperature above 30 degrees Celsius on an annual basis under the very high emission scenario. We're looking at the 2050s period between 2041 and 2070, and we're looking at the difference in the number of very hot days relative to 1971 to 2000. And based on the color legend on the right, we can see that almost all of Southern Ontario and Central Ontario may see an increase of 20 plus very hot days by the middle of the century. Next slide, please. Here's another look at the data in chart form. And right now we're looking at the number of very hot days for the city of Toronto under the moderate emissions scenario in green and very high emission scenario in red. The solid line represents the median or middle value across all of the climate models assessed, and the shaded range represents the 10th and 90th percentiles of all the modeling results. And on this page, you can also download the data in Excel format and the chart as an image to use for further analysis and reporting. Next, let's switch gears to take a look at different risk assessment approaches. These approaches vary by how risks is characterized and assessed. For example, risk can be characterized based on likelihood, for example, of an adverse event occurring and the consequence of that event. You may already be using the likelihood and consequence framework in your risk management process, and climate-related risks may or may not be included. One way of incorporating climate-related risk is through likelihood. For example, based on available climate data, what is the likelihood of a climate event causing supply chain disruptions? On the right, we have an illustration of a likelihood and impact risk matrix. And next to it, we also have a list of risks ranked by impact, likelihood. There's also a rating for vulnerability and speed of onset as possible additional considerations. Next slide, please. Here is an approach that was used in Ontario's provincial climate change impact assessment that was released last fall. In addition to likelihood and consequence, frequency was added to this equation. Likelihood and consequence are used to assess a potential climate impact, such as increased maintenance and rehabilitation, increased operational demands, or increased damages. Likelihood of the impact was scored from improbable to frequent. Consequence ratings range from very low to very high. Frequency of an associated climate driver was included to moderate risk based on how frequent a change in climate condition is anticipated in the future. Frequency here was taken as the distance from the mean or standard deviation. So this is one example of how the existing likelihood and consequence framework can be adapted to integrate climate data based on how frequent a climate driver is expected to occur in the future. Next slide, please. Here are some additional ways of characterizing risk. On the left, we have risk characterized based on hazard, which may include magnitude and severity of the hazard, exposure, what is exposed and where, vulnerability, who or what may be impacted more. And more recently, level of response has also been added to this framework. On the right, we have a framework that is typically used in vulnerability assessments. And within this framework, we can think of the vulnerability of, let's say, an asset or a system as a combination of how exposed it is to a climate hazard, its sensitivity to a climate hazard, and together exposure and sensitivity characterize the potential impact on the asset or system. And then adaptive capacity can be considered as a moderating factor of the asset or system's vulnerability, similar to response in the framework on the left. And in these frameworks, climate data is often used to inform hazard and exposure. On the next slide, let's take a look at a quick example. This is an example of a neighborhood scale vulnerability assessment that we've completed for the Rexdale neighborhood in the northwest corner of City of Toronto in support of TRCA's Sustainable Neighborhoods program in developing integrated sustainability and resiliency action plans. Under exposure, we have indicators that measure the neighborhood's potential exposure to climate-related hazards, such as extreme heat, changes in precipitation, and flooding, for example. Under sensitivity, we have indicators that seek to understand the degree to which the neighborhood may be affected by climate change based on the neighborhood's current conditions, such as demographics and housing characteristics, as well as their perceptions of climate change risks. And finally, under adaptive capacity, we have indicators that measure strengths and resources currently available to the neighborhood to prepare for and respond to the impacts of climate change, such as access to community services, tree canopy, and access to green space. Next slide, please. Continuing on to some other risk assessment approaches, here we have the if-then-so framework. This is often used as a qualitative, high-level assessment of climate change risks, which has been used by many municipalities, for example. The benefit of this approach is that it is simple to apply, incorporates expert and stakeholder knowledge, and can be applied across different sectors or systems. So if a climate stressor were to occur, then what would be the outcomes and what would be the consequences? The if statement can be kept fairly broad, such as increase in very hot days, or you can make it more specific, such as X number of days are anticipated based on local climate projections. And once this table or process is completed, this can result in helpful impact narratives to help convey the story of how climate change is expected to impact your business or organization. Next slide, please. You can also take this approach one step further and map out those relationships to begin to identify cascading risks. Here we can see that a second level of consequence has been identified. You can even identify tertiary consequences if you so desire. The last example approach that we'll cover on the next slide is scenario planning. Scenario planning is a useful strategic planning tool that has been used widely. It is rooted in the military where it was first used, generally for war games, to understand how people would behave in different scenarios. Since the 1970s, it has been used by businesses and perhaps most famously by Shell, and has been attributed to helping the company weather the volatility of oil prices. Today, scenario planning is also used in crisis management to help those involved better respond to different crises. So perhaps familiar to those of you who are also involved in emergency management or business continuity. Scenario planning is the use of narratives of the future to facilitate thinking about possible consequences of different scenarios or courses of action. The narratives can be utopian, dystopian, or anywhere in between. And the purpose of scenario planning is not to predict the future, but to use different scenarios to help us prepare for an uncertain and unpredictable future, or help guide us towards creating the future that we want. Next slide, please. Here's an example taken from a scenario planning for Great Lakes Cities toolkit, which focuses on sustained heat and storms, where the two climate hazards are occurring at the same time. It sets out a broad scenario narrative and how it can be customized and used for workshopping purposes, for example. And next, I will switch gears to take a look at adaptation options. If you can flip one more slide, please. Once we've completed the risk identification, analysis, and evaluation stage using any of the approaches that we've covered, we need to identify and evaluate our risk treatment options. Here is where we can review our risk criteria and determine the appropriate course of action, ranging from doing nothing to reconsidering our objectives. On the next slide, let's take a look at an example from an asset management perspective. This risk table was taken from a rivers and drainage asset management plan in New Zealand. For rivers and drainage assets, an example risk is the increased frequency and/or size of adverse weather effects that render flood control and drainage schemes unsustainable. They've identified the main types of impacts resulting from this event as operational, public health, and safety, as well as financial related. The gross risk is assessed based on consequence and likelihood if nothing was done to prevent or minimize the risk. They then identify current practices and strategies that help reduce this risk and the subsequent residual risk based on current practices and management options. Example management options listed in the last column include further analysis of likely scenarios, recommending relocation retreat of at-risk dwellings and industry, increased awareness and education of flood hazards, and increased flood protection. Next, we'll go over some key considerations when identifying possible adaptation and management options on the next slide. Once again, it's important to keep in mind the goals of climate mitigation and adaptation and try to amplify actions that benefit both, such as renewable energy systems, water conservation, and green infrastructure. Acting in isolation can lead to missed opportunities to maximize co-benefits and minimize trade-offs, leading to further GHG emissions and maladaptation. Next slide. Adaptation may also take many forms. For example, adaptation can occur at different spatial and temporal scales, involve different actors, and require different levels of resource intensity. The image on the left shows 3 different adaptation approaches for flooding, for example, including coping, incremental adaptation, and transformative adaptation. In the first image, the house is underwater, but the person is able to cope by getting on a boat. However, this doesn't address the underlying issue, and the house may be flooded again in the future. And the second image, the house is underwater, and now we have a berm constructed in front of the house to block some of the water. But the house is still underwater because incremental approaches work effectively up to a certain point. And the bottom image, we now have 2 floating amphibious houses. We also have some vegetation upstream to reduce stormwater runoff and slow the rise of water. Transformative approaches take a broader systemic approach and aim to address the root causes. Here, it's about living with water and making room for water to move. A common example of incremental versus transformative adaptation is sandbagging versus planned retreat, or giving room back to the river and other nature-based solutions. Another example might be cooling and warming centers versus more natural cover and adequate housing. This is not to say that incremental approaches are not important. Incremental approaches can also set the stage for transformative adaptation. The important key takeaway here is to focus not just on the symptoms, but the root causes as well. Another consideration when identifying adaptation options for your business or organization is your sphere of influence. What is directly within your business or organization's control? What influence can you exert at the industry or maybe even the global level? Now, we can't do everything alone, but we also shouldn't underestimate the influence we have on others, whether it's your staff, suppliers, customers, or other business partners. Next slide, please. The solutions that we identify should also be integrated and equitable. We can't rely on technology alone. We also need to consider the social and people aspect and nature-based solutions. It's also important to consider equity upfront to ensure that the solutions we implement will not worsen existing inequities. This may involve thinking about who is involved in decision-making and how decisions and actions will affect different employees and customers differently, for example. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned the importance of nature-based solutions as part of integrated solutions. It's worthwhile to dig a little deeper since nature-based solutions benefit both mitigation and adaptation and provides many additional benefits. It encompasses the natural vegetative systems, green technologies, and practices that collectively provide society with a multitude of economic, environmental, social, and health benefits. Natural infrastructure assets are natural systems like forests, wetlands, and grasslands. Low impact development, or LID, focuses on stormwater management in built areas and refers to engineered and enhanced green infrastructure practices like green roofs, bioswales, and permeable pavements. These can be integrated across a range of landscapes from city centers to rural areas. They can also be implemented at a variety of scales, as the graphic on the right shows, from bioswales, backyard gardens, and green roofs at the small scale to green streets, stormwater ponds, and agricultural hedgerows at the medium scale. We can also have large forested parks, conservation areas, and greenways at the large scale. And together, these form a regional network of green infrastructure and stepping stones across the landscape for wildlife habitat. Next, let's turn to how we might start to prioritize different adaptation options. Here's an example from our work in the Rexdale neighborhood once again. After completing the neighborhood scale vulnerability assessment, we identified potential resilience strategies based on the assessment results and input gathered through extensive community and stakeholder engagement. Resilience strategies were guided by the disaster management cycle of prevention and mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery and learning to ensure that we capture strategies that can help improve the neighborhood's resilience before, during, and after an acute shock or chronic stressor. Each strategy was then evaluated based on level of impact of that strategy, as well as the level of effort needed to carry out that strategy. Next slide, please. Here are some additional considerations for prioritizing actions for implementation that your business or organization might consider. These include technical feasibility of the action, its effectiveness, flexibility, costs and benefits, co-benefits, and potential harms associated with the action, the amount of staff time and stakeholder engagement that might be required, the degree of social acceptance, and potential linkages with other adaptation options or priorities. When considering costs and benefits for nature-based solutions, it's important to know that unlike conventional assets, which deteriorate over time, many green infrastructure assets provide more services and benefits as they mature. As the graphic on the right shows, an older, mature tree provides more community benefits than a young tree. Next slide, please. For low-impact development, here's an example of a site-level planning tool that has been developed by the Sustainable Technologies and Evaluation Program, which is a collaborative program between TRCA, Credit Valley Conservation, and Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority. This tool allows users to analyze stormwater quantity and quality benefits of LID for pre- and post-development scenarios. It also provides high-level cost estimates for capital and 25-year maintenance costs. And it's a publicly available free online tool that anyone can use. And the next workshop on March 5th will provide more information about this tool if you're interested to learn more. Now that we've talked about different considerations to keep in mind when identifying and prioritizing adaptation options, let's now walk through a few concrete examples of integrated solutions that have been taken by different businesses and organizations. And hopefully through the Q&A, I'll have an opportunity to hear stories and examples from all of you as well in terms of how your business or organization is adapting to climate change. Next slide, please. Here's an example from the food retail sector. Food is, of course, a necessity that we all need access to before, during, and after an adverse event. So it's no surprise that grocery stores and other food retailers can be anchors during disasters. But what if grocery stores and other food retailers are not just community resilience hubs during times of emergency, but during normal periods as well? This is what a real estate developer has sought to build in the Netherlands, as we'll see in the next slide. This super hub on the next slide is in Groningen. It's an adaptive market hall that is intended as a supermarket as well as a community meeting place. There was initial intention to offer additional programming, such as a cafe and a health center, to provide other opportunities for community members to meet. And these may still be possible as the building and surrounding neighborhood continue to evolve. Another benefit of this community hub model is that it also helps to attract more people to the destination and spend more time there. It's built with a fully wooden support structure with cross-shaped forms that help to withstand strong winds, which also serve as an extended canopy that offers people with shelter from the elements. It also features a large roof that is intended for solar panels and a green roof, so in time, this could maybe become a community resilience hub. Next, we have an example from British Columbia. About a dozen First Nations in BC's north and central coast are working with scientists to train artificial intelligence, or AI models, to count and recognize the types of salmon that are passing through their fish weirs 24 hours a day. With this real-time data, this article from the Narwhal describes a First Nations community that was able to forecast how many salmon would return and then determine how many salmon they can safely harvest each season, or when they might need to hold off to let more salmon spawn so that populations will remain sustainable into the future. And while this is not a story pertaining to a business entity, unlike the first example, I think it still offers many valuable lessons for the fishing industry and potentially other sectors as well. Next, let's take a look at an example right here in Peel Region. Through a partnership with Alice Canada, Peel Region, Credit Valley Conservation, and TRCA have initiated a 3-year pilot program to support farmers in implementing nature-based solutions on their land to improve agricultural sustainability, enhance biodiversity, and support climate adaptation. Examples of on-farm nature-based solutions include tree planting, wetland, stream, and grassland restoration, in-field soil erosion control, and livestock fencing. And leveraging the ALICE program model, participating farmers will receive annual payments for ongoing project maintenance and monitoring efforts. So if you or someone you know might be interested in this program, contact your ALICE Peel coordinator, and that is Holly if you're located in CVC's area of jurisdiction, and Patrick if you're within TRCA's area of jurisdiction. Next, we'll look at the final components of the risk assessment process, which is monitoring, reviewing, and continuous improvement. You can't improve what you don't measure, but you also can't measure everything. So what should we be monitoring? We might start with an extensive list of potential indicators of adaptation progress and success, and from there narrow it down based on your business or organization's capacity to track and analyze the indicators, their potential and likely uses. Are they important and needed? And are more specific metrics needed? And what existing data and monitoring systems are in place or need to be put in place for ongoing tracking? In identifying performance indicators and metrics, it's important to keep in mind what you're measuring. Are you counting inputs? Are you counting inputs, activities, and outputs, or are you measuring outcomes and impacts? All of these can be useful for different purposes, but for external communications, people tend to care more about outcomes and impacts. And of course, depending on your industry, indicators and metrics may need to conform with any applicable legislation or regulation. They may also be guided by targets that your business or organization may want to set to put it on the path of where it wants to be. Next, we'll just take a look at 2 quick examples. Here, we're revisiting the healthcare system, and these tables present examples of outcome-based indicators for the health system on the left and population health on the right. So starting with health system outcomes on the left, we have indicators associated with infrastructure, supply chains, workforce, and patient care. For example, the frequency with which infrastructure damage is experienced from extreme weather events and disasters, impacts on healthcare staff, whether it's physical and mental health, and staff shortages, disruptions to operations such as cancellation of surgeries or transfer of patients. And moving on to population health outcomes on the right, we have indicators associated with a range of health-related outcomes, such as injury and mortality from extreme weather events, to heat-related outcomes, to mental and psychosocial health outcomes and equity impacts. Next, our last example is food processing. Food processing is one component of our food system and an area where there has been little guidance on adaptation monitoring developed. Here is one possible approach that is very much focused on production. For example, we might measure equipment failure, stoppage losses, speed losses, defect losses associated with product quality, and overall yield or production outputs. So that's just one possible approach that we might take to assess and monitoring and track progress on adaptation for the food processing system. Next slide, please. Now we're nearing the end of our whirlwind tour of the climate risk assessment process. In light of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting taking place in Davos this week, the forum has released its 2024 Global Risks Report. And similar to previous years, environmental risks once again dominate the charts. Extreme weather was rated as the top most likely to present a material crisis on a global scale this year. The top 10 most severe global risks in the next 2 years currently capture technological, environmental, societal, geopolitical, and economic risks. But in the next 10 years, more environmental risks make up the list, including critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse, natural resource shortages, and pollution. And given the ever-evolving risk landscape, it will continue to be important to understand, assess, monitor, and review your business or organization's climate-related risks and opportunities and how they interlink with other business risks. And with that, I'll just end off with one last slide. Climate change is the, if not one of the greatest threats of the 21st century, but tackling climate change can also be the greatest opportunity for shaping a better and fairer future. And we all have an important role to play. Thank you, everyone.